of Black Americans and people of color in our country and around the world, that battle has continued. And there's been an ebb and a flow in terms of who's participated in that. And we're going to hear a little bit about that tonight, specifically with the Jewish community. One of the things that makes me proud to be Jewish and very proud to be a rabbi is knowing how many Jews participated in the civil rights movement in the 50s and especially the 60s. There were very small acts of courage that were essential, and there were big acts of courage. Of course, there were Jews who lost their lives right there on the front lines, and there were Jews who played a role in so many different ways. Most famously, Abraham Joshua Heschel was a friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and an activist in the civil rights movement. And it gives me incredible meaning to when I read those parts of Rabbi Heschel's story. And it fit, of course, into his theology and into his life. As many of you, if not most of you know, when he came back from marching in Selma the second time, it was March 21st, 1965, he, of course, very famously said that it felt like his legs were praying. The march was his legs praying, praying to God, and making an impact in the world by making a statement about what was at his core as a person and as a theologian. I was just reading a little bit more about that story, and the night before the march, he and Dr. King and a few other people stayed in a house belonged to a couple named Sullivan and Richie Jean Sherrod Jackson. And in the morning, Mrs. Jackson said she woke up and she saw Abraham Joshua Heschel in one corner with his tallis and his tefillin on praying. Dr. King was in another corner of the room and he was praying. And there were several other people who were also praying. So religion, not that it was the only thing by far, there were plenty of people who weren't religious who were involved in the civil rights movement, but religion being guided by their calling and what they believed the God in scripture was telling them was essential as they looked out into the world and how people had to treat each other and what our responsibility is to help ensure that was a big part of the story. And again, something that we should reflect on. Although so many times, many of us think about the time of Dr. Heschel and the way he marched with Dr. King, that's not the whole story. And the relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community over the years has frayed in some places. It became weaker in some places. And we're going to hear about that as well. So I'm really thrilled that we have Dr. Butler, who's going to talk about the past, present, and God willing, a good future of the Black community and the Jewish community working together. It's really an honor to have you, and the community is very excited. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the Zoom program over to Bob Epstein, the chairperson of our library committee.
Thank you, Rabbi Mishkin. On behalf of the Social Action and Library Committees, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Blacks and Jews in America, History, Memory, and Hope for the Future. Bringing new perspectives to the much discussed relationship between Blacks and Jews, both past and present, is Dr. Anthea Butler, renowned scholar, educator, historian, advocate, and author. As Rabbi Mishkin talked about, many American Jews are proud of the role of Jews going back to the days of the civil rights movement in the 50s and early 60s. Indeed, over the past few years here at TBI, we have heard firsthand accounts from Dr. Lewis Braun, Marion Ingram, Yolanda Beckett, and Bernice Sims, all of whom played integral roles as courageous young civil rights workers in the movement. Each made reference to the strong historical alliances forged between Blacks and Jews who stood side by side in the struggle for racial justice and equality for all Americans. But the heyday of the movement was more than half a century ago, and the decades since have shown that the journey to bring about change remains a work in progress. Over the last few years, Black Lives Movement and other groups have raised our collective awareness to a system still fraught with racism and inequality in law enforcement, education, housing, healthcare, and other areas of life. To say there is much more work to be done is perhaps an understatement. And tonight our goal is to reflect as to where Jews fit in this continuing struggle. To lead us in this reflection, we turn to Professor Butler, an immensely important voice on these critical issues. Before I introduce Professor Butler, I'd just like to take a moment to again encourage you to submit your questions following Dr. Butler's remarks by using the chat function at the bottom of your screens so that Allison can moderate the Q&A and read those questions on your behalf. And speaking of Allison, we are so grateful for her efforts that resulted in Dr. Butler addressing our community this evening. So with that, let me introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Butler is an associate professor of religious and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to her joining the Penn faculty, she held positions at the Harvard Divinity School, University of Rochester, Princeton, and Loyola Marymount University. She previously did her doctoral work at Vanderbilt and more recently was awarded a presidential fellowship at the Yale Divinity School in the 2019-2020 academic year. Her research and writing encompass African American religion and history, politics, evangelicalism, gender, sexuality, media, and popular culture. Among her publications are the books Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World, and a very timely new book coming out shortly. I believe Dr. Butler told me it's coming out this Monday. White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. Professor Butler is widely esteemed by her colleagues in the field of religious studies, as reflected by her election as the president of the American Society for Church History, among numerous other honors she has received. Professor Butler's influence goes well beyond academia because of her astute use of both conventional and social media as tools for scholarly communication. You may have seen her as a commentator on CNN, PBS, BBC, NBC, and the History Channel. Or you may have read her articles in publications such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. You can certainly follow her on her very popular Twitter account. We are so fortunate to have Professor Butler join us tonight. It is now my great pleasure and honor to turn the program over to our guest speaker, Dr. Anthea Butler.
Thank you so much. First of all, Bob, I just want to say thank you for that wonderful introduction. Can you please be my hype man wherever I go someplace? Because I don't know who wrote that, but that was really nice. And I think I want to crib it. So thank you so much. I want to thank Rabbi Mishkin for having me. And also a special thank you to Allison White, who first contacted me and chased me down on email because I've just been so bad on email this semester because I'm chairing the department on top of everything else. So it's a lot of work, but I'm really happy to be with you all tonight. And I'm hoping that we can have one of those kind of conversations that they used to say was just a conversation around the kitchen table in a way, a conversation that is one where you feel comfortable asking me questions and to think of it like, and I want to make this really clear, you finally could ask somebody something that you may have wanted to ask for a long time and you didn't know how to ask it. This is a good time for you to ask those questions to me because I won't be surprised by them, okay? And I come to this at a very interesting thing, and I think I want to start off the story this way because I want you to understand why I have a stake in Black-Jewish relationships. My mother grew up in Southern Louisiana. And the first place she went to college was Xavier University, and she worked the first year for a Jewish family in New Orleans. This was pre-Vatican II. I grew up Catholic. And so I feel like I need to tell this story because I want you to understand kind of a historical place of why I care about this. And because my mother was Catholic, obviously pre-Vatican II, we're talking, 1950s, there was this sense in which Black people and Catholics were told all sorts of things about Jewish people. And she lived with this family and it was fine and it worked out. And then she went to school closer to home the year after. But I think those experiences and the ways in which she talked about the Jewish community always bothered me because they were tainted with certain kinds of things that I felt like, as I knew from being a historian, that just weren't true. And I wondered, where did this come from? Where did these kinds of issues come from? How does she pick this up? How did this become parlance? And so I've spent a lot of time talking to her, and she doesn't feel this way anymore. She's now in her 80s. But it was very interesting to me growing up, and especially when I did my PhD work, why it would be that older Black people had certain kinds of pejorative ideas, despite the fact that people had worked together in the civil rights movement and everything else. So I start there as a way not to sort of rat my mother out, but to help you to understand where my questions come from and why I'm so concerned about this and why this is part of my scholarship. And hang on just one second. It always happens that you end up messing up when you're getting ready to do something. So let me get to my first slide, and I'm going to be showing a PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my screen with you. This normally happens when I'm in class, so you get to have the little mistake. But I want to start off with a picture that both of you know, all of you should know, and that is Senators Raphael Warnock and Senator John Ossoff. And this is from the Georgia Senate race that was held in December of 2019, and then also 2020. Now, here's the thing that's really interesting. And I want to talk about this as a setup for everything else. You notice I have a real picture of them and a cartoon picture of them and a drawing. And I use this because I want to talk about the real versus the ideal. And the ideal about what we think Black-Jewish relationships are and why these two men pose so much nostalgia for us. The nostalgia was simply this. It was a match made in heaven. You had a Black pastor, a pastor who was over Ebenezer Baptist Church, very charismatic. And you had John Ossoff, who's also very charismatic, young senator, vibrant, full of life. And these two men came together like a powerhouse to beat two Republican candidates. And two Republican candidates who, by the way, decided to play all sorts of dirty tricks in this particular election cycle. There were pictures of John Ossoff with a larger nose. There were anti-Semitic remarks made about him. For Raphael Warnock, his Christian faith was besmirched. And he was also linked to people like Jeremiah Wright and others in a way in which that made him sound like he was a radical and he was a communist, or as the former senator kept calling him, a socialist during this time period. Now, what made me think about these two during the election cycle was that this harkened back to a time where we think about Blacks and Jews coming together for the civil rights movement. And if you think about now what's going on in Georgia with the fight for voting rights and everything else, this becomes a very interesting kind of lens in which to go backwards and look at the civil rights movement and move forward to where we are today, to think about Black-Jewish relationships, first of all. Secondarily, to talk about the ways in which that may have fallen apart in certain kinds of ways, or maybe it was a myth and it never really was that way in the first place, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the third point is to talk about where we are today with the rise in anti-Semitism, the rise in the kinds of violence against African-Americans and others in this country, the kinds of racism that we see on display, especially with the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. And all of these things become very important lens in which to look at and understand this relationship and maybe understand what happened to it. So before I begin, I want to just sort of set this up as a frame, as a stage. Think about the ways in which what has happened with the Jewish community also happened with the Black community in the South during this time period. And so I want to go first to Atlanta and to show you the bombing of a synagogue in Atlanta in 1958. And you're going to hear a news broadcast about this. And let me just let this play and hopefully you'll be able to hear it all. Oops, there we go. Okay.
Atlanta has always been a lighthouse of racial and religious tolerance in the South. And we are shocked and amazed that this awful thing could happen in our midst. And we prefer to believe that it is the work of people outside of our city. We have brought every resource of law enforcement to bear. We have offered rewards, and we hope that the perpetrators of this thing will be apprehended. But my friends, here you see the end result of bigotry and intolerance. And whether they like it or not, those who practice rabble-rousing and demagoguery are the godfathers of the cross burners and the dynamite.
Now, you're probably thinking, I didn't know that this happened, or maybe you did. This was October of 1958. This is the bombing of the temple, which was also the home of the Hebrew Benevolent Society that had been established in 1860 by Rabbi Rothschild. This bombing was not a singular event, but a series of bombings of synagogues throughout the South. While the civil rights movement was going on, and this very, nascent, in some ways, a nascent stage before we get to the 1960s, Jews and Jewish communities were also going through these kinds of violent attacks against them because of the perception that A, that they were part and parcel for the civil rights movement, and B, also being persecuted because of who they were. And so I want to show you a chart that gives you kind of a sense. I'm sorry. There we go. All right. Synagogue bombings from 1957 and 1958 in the South. Hopefully all of you can see this. And I just want you to be able to look at this chart and to see the kinds of spaces where this happened. Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama. All of these places in these Jewish bombings of institutions from these 2 years alone. So if we can start to think about not just the things that happened in the civil rights movement, according with violence and burning of Black churches, but to also think about what happened with Jewish houses of worship, synagogues in the South, as well as attacks, you can start to see why these kinds of issues come up, first of all, and then secondarily, the ways in which there's a camaraderie and a coming together in terms of this. And part of that coming together is about what happens in the South and what happens at the beginning of the civil rights movement with an event that everyone knows, which is Jewish Freedom Riders in the summer of 1961. Now, one of the things that ends up happening is that in the summer of 1961, in order to integrate the interstate lines, there was a call set out for people to come and integrate the buses. And so if you've never had a ride on a Greyhound bus before, I did when I was a kid, lots of people did to be able to get around, these buses were segregated. And in order to try to move the needle about this, students were asked to come down to places like Alabama and Mississippi and others to infiltrate, to basically integrate the buses. And here are 3 freedom riders on the right, on your right, maybe, perhaps, Georgia Siegel Bortkowski, Judith Fries, and Mimi Feingold Wheel, who were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, because they were trying to integrate the buses. But it wasn't just buses, it was also restaurants. And so here you have a picture from Newsday from June 16th, 1961, about restaurants closed to clerics who were both Jewish and others, who were a mixed group trying to sit down to integrate the lunch counters. Now, all of these things become very interesting in terms of when we begin to think about what is the kind of participation that's happening. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some scholars who say that many of the participants were actually secular Jews. They were not, religiously affiliated Jews, but that they had a care about civil liberties and civil rights. But I think it's also important to note that there were also these crossovers between Martin Luther King and other bigger Jewish congresses. And I want to read a piece from his address to the National Biennial Conference of Jews that met down in Miami Beach. Every Negro leader is keenly aware from direct and personal experience that the segregationists make no fine distinctions between the Negro and the Jew. The irrational hatred motivating his actions is as readily turned against Catholic, Jew, Quaker, liberal, and one-worlder as it is against the Negro. Some have jeered at Jews with Negroes, some have bombed the homes and churches of Negroes, and in recent acts of inhumane barbarity, some have bombed your synagogues, indeed right here in Florida. Have the Nazis murdered Catholic, Poles, and Jews, Protestant, Norwegian, and Jews? The races of America fly blindly at both of us, not caring which one of us falls. Their aim is to maintain through cruel segregation groups who they use as scapegoats and can facilitate their political and social rule over all people. Our common fight is against those deadly enemies of democracy. And our glory is that we are chosen to prove that courage is a characteristic of oppressed people. However, cynically and brutally, they are denied full freedom and equality. Now, these words of King really speak to what the issue was at hand, that basically that it didn't matter who it was, if you were non-white and non-Protestant, that everyone was going to be suspect and be able to be put under this threat, and especially Jews and African Americans. And so when we're talking about freedom riders or the kinds of things that are happening during 1961, that summer, we have to start to look at the numbers of people and who came out. So out of the 436 riders who came down on the Freedom Summer of 1961, 25% of them were Jewish. Not all of them were rabbis, some were college students, some were just activists and intellectuals. And out of these groups, people like Rabbi Dressner would become a prominent spiritual leader in the broader civil rights movement. Rabbi Dressner had come down to be on a freedom ride down in the South. He was first arrested in 1961, but was also arrested 3 more times in the consecutive summers that followed. He became good friends with Martin Luther King Jr. and argued that many Black freedom riders who let Philp down when King refused to join them on the rides and said, you know, try not to be angry at him. This is not the thing that he needs to be doing. But there was a big question about the rides. A lot of people felt like the rides were promoting violence because people would do the violence against those who were trying to ride and they would be arrested. But at the same time, this sort of tension that happened would be live tensions that happened later on. And so let me show you another clip, which is from Rabbi Joachim Prince at the March on Washington in 1963. Sorry about that.
As an American Jew, as American.
Oh, sorry. This is so sensitive. Every time I touch it, it like loses it. I don't know why I just lost that. It may not play for me. I'm sorry. That is a mess up. And everything played before I got here. But let me just talk about this too. One of the things that I think is really important is that we're used to seeing the symbolism of Rabbi Heschel and other rabbis surrounding Martin Luther King at the March on Washington, at Selma, all of these other places. And so what has happened because of that is that we have a memory and we have a history. What I mean by the history is that we have a true history about who's there, but we also have a memory about what happened. And that memory is this. The memory goes that we have this shared history. That's first of all, Blacks and Jews. Second, that shared history caused us to come together for the civil rights movement to fight for rights. And that third, that somehow this all fell apart in certain kinds of ways. Now, I think what's important to talk about in the midst of this is why it fell apart. So this is the next part that I want to go to. And for a minute, I'm going to turn off this so that you can really see me, because I want to talk directly to you about what I think happened here and this history. Part of what happens in this history is that from the March on Washington to Selma to the assassination of Martin Luther King, there is a sense in which there's a rise within the African-American community, and that rise is a nationalistic rise. That rise comes about because of tensions that are happening in the movement, the tensions that happen between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission about how the civil rights movement should run. Everybody kind of gets caught in the middle of that because the battle is basically this. How do we go about finishing up the civil rights movement? Is this going to be radicalization, or is it going to be gradualization that now that we have the Civil Rights Act and everything else signed, what do we do now? But there was a sense for students and others that this becomes more of a nationalistic movement, a Black nationalist kind of movement. And so when you begin to see the rise of the Black Panthers and other groups in the late 60s, this becomes kind of an issue and a tension within the Black community. That's one. The second thing that happens is something that's very important in history. 1948, the Nation of Israel is formed, but the 1967 war makes the eyes of the nation and the eyes of the Jewish Americans go to Israel. That war becomes very important. And this is the beginning of a different kind of Zionism, the ways in which people think that this is very important. And the national issues in America are not as important as those in Israel. Now, author Mark Drollinger talks about this, and he basically says that this whole thing that happens as an alliance, this Black nationalism, actually it impacts Jewish leadership in a way that Jewish leaders begin to leverage thinking about Black power to strengthen Jewish identity. So in a way, what happens is these two things that are happening in both of our communities fuel each other, but they don't fuel each other to come together. They fuel each other, but they bring these two groups apart. And so what we begin to see in the latter part of the 60s and early 70s and beyond is a different kind of thing. The trajectory in the African-American community is that people begin to run for office, they begin to rise for power, they dismantle these connections that they have previously had. And I think especially in the African-American community, one big thing that happens is the, as I like to call it, the disintegration of the normal kinds of places in which you have these things happening. So in other words, the NAACP, while it may look strong on the outside, is not as strong as it used to be. These kinds of organizations are not the kinds of organizations that bridge these gaps between the Jewish community and the Black community. These ties begin to fray in certain kinds of ways. What happens in the Jewish community is you have more of a push towards Israel, and that you have different groups politically who focus in on Israel as a way to get voting to happen, first of all, and then secondarily, in order to create lobbies. And so while we had, in some ways, effective cooperation between clergy members from the African-American community and the Jewish community, what you have in the 70s and beyond is a fractured situation, and a fractured situation that ends up being really bad when we begin to think about some of the things that happened in the 80s, whether we're talking about Louis Farrakhan, whether we're talking about the kinds of things that Jesse Jackson says, and I won't go into all those words because all of you know all of that history, right? I don't have to repeat that history. But this begins to fracture all of this. So that when we come to a place like today, and this is just recently, which just infuriated me no end because it made me really angry, was the latest thing that happened between a Black actor, Nick Cannon, who had been married to Mariah Carey, who said lots of Jewish conspiracy theories. And this was also picked up by a former Eagles football player, Deshaun Jackson. And so these kinds of things, when they happen in the community, you have to be scratching your head and wondering, what is going on here? What is happening? So I want to talk about this a little bit from the African-American community, and then I'm going to go back to show you the kinds of things that I think we should be concerned with. One of the things that I think doesn't get talked about very much in the African-American community, and I'm going to talk about this both as a historian and as somebody who talks about African-American religion, is the idea about conspiracy theories and how they affect the community. So these conspiracy theories that also come into the community because people are teaching these erroneous things about what they think Jewish history is, unfortunately have these kinds of, how do I want to put this? The kind of valence that you would see through some other anti-Semitic literature. And I was looking at one of these charts before I got on tonight that basically said that there's a, I forgot, it was like 15 to 20% in the African-American community about people who actually believe anti-Semitic literature and anti-Semitic tropes. And so I think this becomes really important when we begin to think about the ways in which people, especially young people, pick these things up, or especially in entertainment, because of what they think people own or what they think that they do. And I think this is part of the issue that we have right now. Some of this has gotten through the internet. Some of it has gotten through kind of literature that's Afrocentric, and others where people are pitting groups against each other. Or if we think about groups like the Black Israelites who say that we are the true Jews, this becomes a racialized issue. So that's part of what is happening here when you hear these kinds of things. That's first off. I think the second thing that's really important to say is that our politicians haven't figured this out very well. And so the Warnock and Ossoff pairing really made for a very interesting kind of conversation to happen, because these two men realized that they could capitalize on a previous relationship that was good. And you also had somebody who really understood that from a historical perspective, and that was Reverend Dr. Warnock, who actually spoke a lot about Abram Heschel throughout his time on the campaign trail. I mean, even the day that he was declared the winner, he spoke of Rabbi Heschel and made comments about him to talk about his victory in winning the Senate. And so I think these are places where the change is beginning to happen. But there's another part of this that I think is really important. And this is the part that I feel most strongly about right now, because it's not just about history, and it's not just about dismantling these kinds of conspiracy theories that continue to plague us. It's about dismantling anti-Semitism. And so now I'm going to share my screen with you for the last time to show you the last bit of this, because this is where my recent research comes into a lot of things. And I'm sorry, this keeps showing up and I don't know why it's showing up. Okay, this is from the Anti-Defense League, Anti-Semitic Incidents Comparisons from 2017 to 2019. And you can see how these have gone up from 2017 to 2019. I will be very interested to see what 2020 looks like. If you can remember back just a couple of years ago, when there were synagogues that were being spray painted, there were graveyards and gravestones being desecrated. This was just rampant all over the place. And part of the reason why this is happening is because of the spread of anti-Semitic literature on the internet, these chat rooms, and what we're going to see from the January 6th insurrection very soon is that a very concerted effort to be for anti-Semitism. And this is also coming into the African-American community. It's not just about that. And I can think of the murder of a couple of that happened in a Jewish community in New Jersey, and then also with the rabbi that was attacked in New York. These were from Black groups that were basically where they thought they were Black Israelites, essentially. And this is sort of a kind of a new thing that's happening. And I'm not quite sure what is happening here, but I do think that it's important for us to begin to look at this in terms of our communities and to think about how, not just for the Jewish community to be protected, but for African Americans, especially for African American clergy members in churches, to be aware of this and to come out against it. This is a picture from the members of the Tree of Life Synagogue and New Light Congregation in Pittsburgh, standing together with members of the Emmanuel AME Church on January 20th, 2019 in Charleston, South Carolina. These two communities are united by hate, and they're united by hate because they were both attacked by people who believed in anti-Semitic things, who believed in racism. And this is a moment in which I see sadness in this picture, but I also see a promise. And that promise is the kind of promise that when we come together to fight against these things, we're much stronger, first of all. And secondarily, I think it brings out what the things our communities have gone through, first of all, and secondarily, what it is that we need to be acutely aware of in the future. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, anti-Blackness has always been there. And we both need to come together to try to understand the spaces and places in our communities where these things exist, first of all. And secondarily, how can we care for each other in the midst of all of that? I show these pictures from Black Lives Matter and from Los Angeles in June 2020 after the death of George Floyd to talk about how there might be some rapprochement. And I want to actually have a discussion with you all about this afterwards. This sign on the left says Jews for Black Lives. And I know that Black Lives Matter has been a big conversation in the community, in part because of people like Patrisse Cullors and others who have been very much Farrakhan supporters. And I will talk about that in a minute, because I will be frank with you and say that Farrakhan is not the important person that you think he is. It is just unfortunate that Black leaders and organizers continue to follow after him because he doesn't have that much power in the first place. The other picture is a group of Orthodox Jews who held a rally and march in solidarity with Black Lives Matter in Crown Heights in June 7, 2020 in Brooklyn. This is probably, in some ways, maybe not to you in New York, but to others, a surprising picture. one of the things that happened with George Floyd, I believe, was that the brutality that was shown across the screens over and over and over again of the policeman kneeling on George Floyd's neck was sort of a wake-up call, and a wake-up call that could not be contained simply within the confines of Black Lives Matter and the Black community. It was something that affected us all, first of all, as Americans, and secondarily affected us because any of us at any time could find ourselves in the midst of a really terrible situation, whether we're thinking about Emmanuel AME or what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue, or any of the other myriad events that have happened with synagogue bombings and other kinds of events that have happened. This way in which life is not valued is an important part of what is happening right now in all of our communities. And so when we got to January 6th, and I'm showing these two pictures, which are very difficult, I'm sure, to see, but I want to show them to talk about the reason why January 6th is not just an aberration. January 6th really put on the map a couple of things that were very important. And I want to close with this because I think it's at the crux of everything. And as a religious studies professor, and especially somebody who teaches about the history of Christianity, I think this is important. The marriage of nationalism with Christianity in America right now is at a dangerous stage. And I say this both for African Americans, and I say this for the Jewish community, because what happened at January 6th is a conflagration, and it was a conflagration of anti-Semitism, racism, fascism, and all of the kinds of things that we saw on the rise in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and even before then. And so when you have people with these kinds of shirts, and I don't have to explain to you what they are because you know, and they feel comfortable to go into the place of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. with this kind of attire on, lets us know that we're in another kind of time period in this country. We're in a time period in which that the kinds of open racism, the kinds of open anti-Semitism, the kinds of open warfare against people of color, people of different faiths who are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant is a problem right now. And where I think that we need to think about how the history of the civil rights movement and the history of activism can help us is in the following ways. First of all, we need to have robust conversations in our community. The kind of conversation that I'm having with you tonight is a conversation that I have been trying to have for the past few years in different kinds of places, because I think it's very important for us to realize the existential threat to our communities on the horizon. The existential threat for your community is anti-Semitism, whether that is coming from white nationalist Christians or whether that is coming from African Americans who believe in conspiracy theories and are willing and able to join in with these kinds of activities and violence because they don't understand what it is that they are being fed that is misinformation and disinformation. That's number one. Number two, I think there's a place in which clergy members need to start to come together, whether we're talking about pastors of African American churches, rabbis and others, and different kinds of groups. We don't have the same kind of foundational groups like the NAACP and all of these things in the Black community that function in the ways that they should have functioned because they've been, basically gutted and don't have the same kind of money or funding that they need to have. And so we need to think about different ways of how we come together. And third, I think this is an educational program. And this is where I try to do this as much as I can in my classrooms, but I think there needs to be more. And I think that part of that has to do with what we're exposing our children to and how we start to teach our children about hatred, anti-Semitism, racism, all of these things together. As I had said before, and I did not start off my speech with this, but I'll say it now. I am someone who really cares about what happens between the Jewish community and the Black community. What I think is part of the problem in America is that we tend to think about, well, there's the Israel conversation, and however you feel about the Israel conversation is how you feel about the Israel conversation. And there are very strong words on both sides about that. There's strong things that people say about Palestinians. What I think right now is that we shouldn't throw away those conversations, But I actually think that the conversation of what is happening in America right now is the existential threat for the next year to 3 years. It is not a conversation about how are we going to deal with Israel? How do we politically deal with Israel? How do we deal with Palestinians? Those things are important, but they are on an international scale. The national scale of what we are dealing with here in this country is a dangerous time. Because of coronavirus, because of everything that has happened, our communities face peril, whether they face peril from violence from outside or they face, extinction from other kinds of things, the virus, for instance. We need to really begin to think about how we come together and how we can understand not just our history, but our present circumstance. And so my plea tonight and what I hope that we can do is to have a conversation about how that moves forward, first of all. Secondarily, for you to be able to ask me the questions that you have been concerned about to ask, and with somebody who is open to answering those questions. And third, to think about the ways that you personally can reach out and begin to start to talk to others outside of your synagogue and to make, relationships and connections with others in Black churches and other kinds of Black religious groups so that we can fight against this kind of racism and hatred that we see in our country that is proliferating our screens and every place else right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Butler. That was a lot of food for thought and a lot of great information. I know some of it was new to me and I hope was new to others as well. If you want to submit your questions to the chat, I'll be glad to ask them. I guess my question that I have in the meantime, while I'm waiting for people to submit some, is—
You just muted yourself.
There we go. That I have encountered hesitancy among some people in the Jewish community to participate in Black Lives Matters protests and things like that because of the history of that organization. And I just wondered if you would comment about that.
Sure. I think one big thing I could probably dispel right now is that you can see the signs up for Black Lives Matter, but their Black Lives Matter group in every city around the world now. It's actually become this kind of bigger thing, right? So whenever you see a Black Lives Matter like rally or something, it may not even be connected to the original group. Okay, so that's the first thing. I think that's really important to say, because I think for people, who may be worried that, oh, I don't want to sign on to something that I shouldn't sign on to, right? I think that the question is you've got, it's hard sometimes to figure out who's organizing and what, and then you see a Black Lives Matter sign, and it might not even be Black Lives Matter who organized the march. So I think that's the first thing, is being sort of aware and thinking about how can you tap into other kinds of Jewish organizations that have a relationship to people who are saying, yes, let's go out and march, and no, let's not go out and march, right? So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that I understand that people may not want to be involved in that particular way, but there are other ways you can be involved. There are things that you can do. The NAACP is great, but there are also local, organizations that do things in the area as well, especially in the New York City and outer environs that, you can tag along with. There are churches who do things as well. I think that's really important to start to think about different ways, instead of letting like Black Lives Matter ends up becoming part of it is parlance of, how Fox News talks about it. And then there's the other Black Lives Matter. I mean, there are people who don't make money off of Black Lives Matter, okay? And then there's people who made a lot of money off of Black Lives Matter, all right? And the initial way that Black Lives Matter starts is because of, Trayvon Martin and everything. And so I think that it's really important to sort of think about where you fall on that spectrum, first of all, and then secondarily, to make sure as much as you possibly can, find out who's doing the march. When everything happened with George Floyd, it here in Philadelphia, it became like this whole thing. Nobody even knew. It was just like, everybody's going out to march, right? And so there were people with Black Lives Matter signs and everything, but you didn't know that there was somebody who was organizing it. It was just like Black Lives Matter as a statement, but not as an organization. And I think that that's really important to separate the two and understand that one is a statement about how we should value Black lives in the midst of all this. But the second thing is to say, yes, some things are the organization, but those are the kind of things you see on the platform or when you see somebody saying, I'm a representative of Black Lives Matter.
Okay, thank you. We have a bunch more questions now. One is, do you have any examples, other examples of the synergy brought by Warnock and Ossoff? And is there an effort to bring this into the narrative and set as an example to make kind of a different truth?
Yeah, this is really interesting that you're asking this. I'm going to say stay tuned, because this is something that I'm about to find out whether or not this is going to happen in terms of us figuring out how do we see these individual Ossoffs and Warnocks in different communities around the country. Because I think there are things that are happening on the ground, right? In terms of Black and Jewish relationships, I know that here in Philadelphia, there are clergy people and synagogues that get together, but we don't have a real clear picture of this right now. And that's something that I have been really interested in. And I've done a couple of synagogue talks and probably will be doing more, but the question becomes is who's actually doing this work right now? And that's a big question mark, because we don't know. There's things that happen, in individual communities in terms of, interfaith groups and things that come together for, justice issues, especially usually when somebody gets shot or something happens in the city, but we don't know. And I hate to say that, but I think that this is a moment in which we need to actually really do some research to find that out. So first of all, and then secondarily, I think, the other part that I am very much interested in is what is the blueprint, right? What is the blueprint for right now? Because everything has changed so much. You can't get together in certain kinds of ways because of the pandemic. You can get together online, you can do social media, you can do all kinds of things. But I think the question becomes is what is valuable at this particular time period? And I think and this is the last thing I'll say, what I know we can do is to get together in the ways that Tree of Life and Emmanuel AME Church got together. We always get together when something horrible happens. I would like to see us get together when something good happens, because I think it can't just be the crisis. It needs to be, the joy as well. And we need to, come together on different holidays to share our holidays and do that. And I've gone to friends' houses for Pesach, and I've been to Shabbat. I've done all this stuff as an individual, but I would like to see people do this in a better, more, how I say, deliberate way.
Yeah, well, I think that we had some follow-up to that. One person was asking, what can we do to kind of continue that work, and what are the strategies? I know you mentioned that you talked about the NAACP not being as powerful. So if we in the Jewish community, like, we know what our, who our
You know your organization.
We know our organizations.
Know your orgs.
If we were gonna go look for that as places to partner with, where would we look aside from the local Black church?
Well, I think, part of it is a local Black church. The other part I would say is, to be honest with you, I think one of the interesting spaces to try to, break into is the educational system. In Philadelphia, we have a lot of charter schools. We've got a lot of people who are educating kids. And so one thing is to just say, hey, let the kids come over to the Jewish Community Center or whatever, when we don't have to do this again, right? When we're not in a pandemic. Bring the kids together. This is something I've been really interested in terms of wishing that I could, we could do these things. I think things like birthright and all this are really interesting. I would like to see Jewish and Black kids, when we get out of this pandemic, be able to do like a similar kind of trip to do civil rights, because I think that would be really fantastic. Teenagers and older, college age kids, to like say, let's talk about this shared history that you have. and what kinds of things have happened and how do we educate each other. So that's one. I would say other organizations, if you feel uncomfortable, with Black Lives Matter, there's other different ways to be able to reach out into the community, and you need to look in the local area to see what other kind of Black orgs are politically or socially are doing this. And election times are big times like this. I think this is one of the things that Stacey Abrams and other organizers did really well in Georgia, is to come together on these kinds of issues where you both have a stake, right? You have a stake, morally and otherwise, because of what's happening politically. So I think this is how, Ossoff and Warnock won, because they were able to make appeals across these communities to say, you need to vote for both of these men because it's going to change the way in which Georgia gets certain kinds of things. So I think that kind of stuff is really important. And, we're about to come up to 2022 and the election cycle that's going to be important, and you've got a lot of stuff going on in New York right now. So, that we're talking about, mayor of New York, or whatever's going to happen with the governor, there's ways in which to come together on certain kinds of issues that don't even have to be religious ones.
Okay, thank you. And then we also have someone who commented about Eric Ward, who I know you know all about, describes the result of his research into white supremacy as identifying the root as anti-Semitism, and your photos, conveyed that. And what should we expect of the government to address white supremacy, and what should we do ourselves?
This is a good one.
Great
Let me
question.
talk about the government first. You better hope that Merrick Garland gets busy with the Justice Department. Okay. And I cannot tell you how much time has been lost and why, anti-Semitism has been on the rise, is in part because the Justice Department basically just kind of, disconnected from all of that. Trump did not want that. And this is where I want to talk to everybody who's Jewish and voted for Trump and say, do you understand that you worked for one thing, but this is not your best in your best interest, because he did this thing. And because he did this thing and took that away from the Justice Department, we have not counted all these hate crimes and all these things that are happening. You have to rely on the ADL and others to count all these things that have happened and to even come after people. So I would like to see, the government, especially if we're talking about the federal government, to come at this very hard in terms of the January 6th insurrection. That's first of all. On the local, state, and national level, yes, that needs to happen as well. But, I did not track this, but what was really problematic for me was that a lot of the desecrations that happened to the tombstones and, synagogues and things like that, many times people hadn't even been charged for any of that stuff. It was just sort of like pushed away. And, police departments went on to the next thing. But I think these things need to be classified much more strongly as hate crimes on the local and state level, so that, there's a how do I want to say, a deterrent that is embedded in all of this, so that people don't do it. In terms of what you should do yourselves, I think, and this is where the conversation gets scary, but I'm going to say this. I think what you should do yourselves is to, first of all, educate yourself about what is happening. I think that is really important. There's a tendency not to want to look at this stuff because it's very painful. But I think secondarily is to educate yourself. And this is where I get into the other part of this, is that, the alliances that get made sometimes in the Jewish community with people like evangelicals, these aren't your friends. And I don't know how to say that in a nice way, but I'm just going to say it in a blunt way and say, not your friends, because, on the one hand, it's the friendliness of, yes, we support Israel and all this other stuff, but there's another thing that's going on in the back of it. We want you to be us. We want you to convert. We take this anti-Semitism. I mean, I think people forget back in the 2008 election cycle that one of the things that John McCain had to do was get rid of John Hagee as one of his supporters, because he said all this crazy stuff about, Hitler was a hunter of the Jews. And it was horrible. It was horrible anti-Semitism couched in the face of, yes, I love Israel. And so you have to be able to begin to see behind some of these languages and understand what it is that people promote. And I have to say, unfortunately, that I've had to talk to Black pastors about this too, because they harbor some of these same kind of ideals. And so while I'm saying to you on the one hand to reach out, I'm also saying part of reaching out is also confronting. when you see these kinds of things, and you have to understand what the language is behind them.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. And we have another thought-provoking question. How do you effectively teach a shared history when the fact remains that Jews are largely white privileged community? And how do you engender trust in the African American community that the Jewish community can be an effective partner in pressing for equality and human rights?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I mean, I think that I will put it to you this way. Not everybody in the Black community is poor either. So
Right.
that's the first thing I have to sort of say, and say that because I'm in a place like that's Penn, and what has shocked me in the 12 years I've been at Penn is the fact that I've got, students from a wide variety and range of places. And the students that I end up thinking that always have the money are the ones that don't have the money. And the ones that I don't think have the money have a whole bunch of money. So I'm always surprised about that because you never can tell in a classroom. So when I'm in a classroom, I decide that I'm just going to go, okay, I'm going to treat everybody equally, first of all. And what does that get me? Where does that take me? And what I talk about in terms of privilege, we can talk about white privilege and all of that. But usually when you say the word privilege, people just shrink up because they just go like, well, what do you mean I'm privileged? I don't feel like I'm privileged, right? And so it sets up a defensiveness in people. And I try to take the conversation away from that, first of all, and to say, what is it that we can do together to fight for this one particular thing? How do you see yourself within a community? Because I think what happens is we don't talk about community enough. And I think between the Black and the Jewish community, what we have is not quite a shared experience, right? But an experience in which there has been persecution. There has been, a sense in which we have histories that are horrible histories. And what I often hear African Americans say is that, God, I just wish we would be like the Jewish community, remind people every time of all the bad things that happen to us. And I'm like, do you think that's fun? Do you think that that's good to sit there and talk about these kinds of really terrible things and these awful histories? No, it's not. But I understand what their meaning is because they feel like it's a constant struggle to tell that story. So I think that one of the things that I try to do is to show my students how all of us share in each other's stories. And I think that's an effective way to begin to talk about what is happening. You may be in a different, socioeconomic space, but the kinds of real human things about, somebody not liking you because of the color of your skin, or not liking you because of your faith, or to do what they did to John Ossoff and to change his nose and to depict him a certain way. These kinds of things really resonate with people and help them to understand what's at stake. What is at stake? And so the ways in which both of our groups are racialized in certain kinds of ways, I think is an important space to start, even though that's starting in a really hard place for a lot of people, because some people just don't even know that or realize it, especially if they're young.
Right. Thank you. So I guess to close out, there's two things I want to ask. One is you mentioned that Farrakhan was not somebody worth paying attention to. So can you tell us some Black leaders who are worth paying attention to? Like if I'm going to go follow on Twitter, Instagram, like who should I be reading? Who should I be looking at?
I think you should be reading people like Otis Moss III, who's, basically over Trinity. He took over the church that Jeremiah Wright was at, and I think he's a great person in terms of thinking. I mean, I think you follow Warnock because it's not just about, what he's saying, what he's doing. I think you follow people like Yvette Flunder, who's in California and San Francisco. And I can give you another list if you want to pass out,
Yeah, that would be good.
People to sort of follow and discuss. I mean, you also want to think about, I know somebody in the media area, Aubrey Hendricks, who is really good and is coming out with a book about, sort of political kinds of Christian stuff. But I think it's really useful to be reading all of these people. I was going to think of Ebony Marshall Turman. There's a ton of people that I could point you to. Jennifer saying yes on Ebony. Yeah, she's at Yale Divinity School, and she's really great. And I think starting to think about people who can bring you in different ways. I mean, obviously, people have been reading a lot of Ibram Kendi, anti-racism stuff. I think that's really important. What I wish I saw, and this is something that I've been working on in the background, is more people who are writing about this relationship between Blacks and Jews right now. And I think that that's going to change. I know somebody, J. Cameron Carter, who's at Indiana, who's working on a little bit of this in his next book. But I think, it's a sense in which you have to start to sort of sort through people, and it's not the usual suspects, right? I mean, I would also say, for a good read on the African American community in terms of people who are out there writing in the New Yorker, Jelani Cobb, I would say is a great person. You want Jamel Bowie, who's on the New York Times page. When he's not really angry, Charles Blow can be really good. Charles Blow can be hit and miss sometimes about how he writes about things. But I think people like that, you start to think about and think, how can I, sort of get into this in a different kind of way, right? What is troubling me, because I'm actually one of the few people who will actually deal with, the kinds of Christian nationalism stuff, that happened at January 6th, and trying to think about that from a broader, Christian perspective. And if you really want to get, I would say I'd recommend this book, not because you need to read about Christianity and not because it's about Black people, but I think it's really good for you to read in another way, is Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Dumed. And that's MEZ at the end. And I'll send you this one too, if you remind me, Allison. But this is really good to sort of understand this white Christian nationalism stuff that's going on, because that's part and parcel of some of what you see, especially with Black pastors. I mean, I have to admit and just say that a lot of these Black churchmen have, inculcated a lot of these ideas. So I hope that's a good sort of little bit.
No, it's great. That's great. And then finally, the last thing, I just wanted to make sure you told us about your book and you tell people where to get it.
Okay, so now this is where I get to be, I do my little spiel. Hi, Anthea Butler, White Evangelical Racism, the Politics of Morality in America. Basically what this book about is this, the ways, it's a history book. And I think it's actually a really instructive little history book to read, because what I'm doing is taking the 19th to 21st century and talking about, here's the ways in which evangelicals have been racist. And they don't like to talk about this about themselves very much. And it's not a book about Trump, and I want to make that clear, but it'll help you understand the ways in which evangelicals have used morality to promote the kinds of policies and politics that they have. And so whether we're talking about the civil rights movement and somebody like Billy Graham, who basically wasn't really for the civil rights movement, who was just gradualist, to somebody like a Jerry Falwell, or what happened with George W. Bush and, Islam and all of that, and how that became a real big thing, especially with the 9/11 mosque, as many of you know from living in the New York area. I think it's really important to see this in the political sense too, about the relationship between evangelicals and Israel, because this is an important part of their whole moral construction of themselves. And they sort of put themselves as the protector of Israel and the protector of Jews, when there's some other things that are going on theologically and morally that they want to have happen that have nothing to do with you living out your life being Jewish.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
and you can buy it on Amazon or UNC Press.
Okay.
Amazon is always the easiest, or local bookstore.
I think I covered all of the questions. Oh, yes. If you send me the list, Professor Butler, I will.
List.
I can send it to the attendees. If you are not a member of the temple, perhaps you could email me your address. I'm going to put my email in the chat. So if you want to get a copy of Professor Butler's list, just email me and let me know you want to get a copy of her list. And if there are any Jewish organizations that you think are doing good work
Yeah, I will definitely put that too. Yeah.
area, give us, I mean, I know AGC is doing some, and, you know, I've seen a few things. from
And
A-
I'd give the plug to the Cat Center too, if you all don't know about the Cat
Right.
Center, because that's where you saw the talk, and they're finishing
Yeah.
up this whole series in the next month and a half. So,
Yeah.
and they've got some really good talks online.
So thank you, everybody. And I want to give a shout out to Kathy Selden and Julie Cheevers in the TBI office, who helped us out with the logistics for the evening. And thank you to Rabbi and Rita and Bob, and especially to Dr. Butler.
Thank you so much for having me. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Dr. Butler.
Bye.
Thank you.
We
Thank you so
appreciate
much.
it.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Allison, great job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Butler.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And